The silence came first, a subtle hush that crept into the spaces between things. It began not as an absence of sound, but as an absence of meaning across the sprawling, interconnected systems of the Cygnian hegemony, a network of worlds bound by 1,000 years of unbroken peace and shared data. The first sign of the end was a quiet corruption. Navigators on long-haul freight lines would blink, momentarily forgetting a star's name, only to find it restored on their charts a second later, a flicker in their own memory they dismissed as fatigue. Calm weavers, whose entire lives were spent in the psychic resonance of the great network, would feel a sudden cold spot in the data stream, a pocket of absolute null where a thought should have been. These were minor anomalies, glitches in a system so vast and complex that perfection was an acknowledged impossibility. They were logged, archived, and forgotten. Tiny cracks in the foundation of a civilization that believed itself eternal. But Ilara felt them all. She was an archivist of the fallen, a curator of ghosts, and her senses were tuned to the frequencies of the forgotten. Her domain was the Lyceum of Lost Stars, a moon-sized repository suspended in the void between the twin suns of Cygnus X1. It was not a place of history, but of anti-history, a library of all that had been intentionally erased. Here, she tended to the whispers of civilizations that had failed, empires that had collapsed, and races that had simply vanished from the galactic stage. Her work was considered a sacred but morbid duty, like a tender of a graveyard for gods. Most saw her as a relic herself, a woman who spoke the language of endings in a galaxy that had forgotten how to die. The feeling she got from the anomalies was not one of malfunction, but of deliberate, meticulous erasure. It felt like a redacted document, a story being unwritten line by line. She sat in the heart of the Lyceum, a cavernous sphere where light itself seemed to be absorbed by the sheer weight of memory. Data streams, glowing like ethereal nerve fibers, pulsed from floor to ceiling, each one a chronicle of a dead world. Closing her eyes, she reached out, not with the psychic touch of a weaver, but with the trained empathy of her discipline. She sought the echoes, the faint psychic residue left behind by sudden, catastrophic loss. For weeks, she chased the cold spots through the network, cross-referencing their appearances with the Lyceum's most forbidden archives, the sundered texts, the lament of 1 billion souls, the chronicles of the Voidbringer. These were not historical records, but mythological warnings. Tales so old and terrifying that the hegemony's founders had classified them as allegorical fiction, cautionary tales against hubris. They spoke of the Ethel, the architects of silence. They were not conquerors who came with fire and warships. The texts described them as a presence, a sentience that perceived other cultures not as rivals, but as noise, as chaotic variables in a perfect, silent equation. They did not destroy. They corrected. They unmade. They moved through the cosmos like a tide. And where they passed, history, memory, and even physical law were smoothed into a featureless calm. Worlds were not left as ruins. They simply ceased to have ever existed. Ilara felt a tremor of fear, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the chill of the Lyceum. The patterns matched. The fleeting amnesia, the data voids, the sensory ghosts reported by deep space pilots, they were all precursors, the faintest ripples of the Ethel's returning tide. She took her findings to the hegemony's ruling body, the quorum of edicts, A council of beings so ancient and serene they conducted their affairs in a state of suspended animation, communicating through modulated light and pure logic. Her request for an audience was itself an anomaly, and her presence in the gleaming, sterile chamber was a disruption. She stood on a disk of polished obsidian, a small, dark figure surrounded by the towering crystalline forms of the quorum. "Venerable minds," she began, her voice a small, human thing in the vast, silent hall. "The anomalies in the network are not glitches. They are evidence of a pattern described in the oldest pre-hegemony texts. They are the herald of a race known as the Ethel, a soft pulse of light, the color of condescension, emanated from the lead counselor, Archivist Ilara. Your dedication to the echoes of the past is commendable, but you mistake myth for data. The sundered texts are metaphorical constructs, philosophical exercises." "They are not metaphors," Ilara insisted, holding up a data slate that glowed with her compiled evidence, the energy signatures of the voids. The specific psychic frequencies of the memory lapses they align perfectly with the 7-stage erasure process described in the lament. We are in the first stage, the unraveling. It is subtle, designed to go unnoticed, to make us doubt our own senses before the true correction begins. Another pulse of light, this one tinged with impatience. "We have analyzed the network anomalies. They are the result of a resonance cascade from the Cygnus X1 singularity, a predictable consequence of our proximity. Your correlation is a product of confirmation bias. You see the ghosts you're trained to see." Ilara's hands tightened around the slate. She knew this would be the response. The hegemony was built on the unshakable belief that all things were knowable, quantifiable, and, ultimately, controllable. A threat that operated outside the known laws of physics and causality was not just a danger, it was an intellectual heresy. The singularity does not erase memory, she argued, her voice rising with a desperation she could not contain. It does not target specific cultural data nodes. What is happening is not random. It is precise. It is intelligent. It is a weapon. The final pulse from the quorum was dismissive, a cool, blue light that signaled the end of the audience. "Your warning is noted. Archivist. We recommend you return to your lyceum and confine your study to the ghosts that are already dead." She left the quorum chamber not with anger, but with a profound and chilling certainty. They would do nothing. They were too logical, too ordered, too sane to comprehend an enemy that consumed sanity itself. Returning to her silent moon, Ilara felt like a lone watchman on a shore, watching the tide pull back unnaturally far, knowing the tsunami was coming while everyone else admired the exposed seashells. She delved deeper into the archives, going beyond the sundered texts into the raw data fragments they were based on, the uncurated psychic screams of the Ethel's last victims from an eon ago. She found what she was looking for in a shattered memory crystal of a long-dead race of empaths. It was not a story, but a feeling, a raw, undiluted sensation of being unmade. The memory described the Ethel's presence not as a physical entity, but as a change in the fundamental nature of reality. It began with colors seeming less vibrant, music losing its emotional resonance, love feeling like a distant, intellectual concept. The universe, piece by piece, was being bled of its meaning. The crystal's final echo was a single, terrifying thought. They are not killing us. They are convincing us we were never alive at all. As she absorbed the echo, a klaxon, silent for a century, blared through the Lyceum. It was an automated alert, tied directly to the hegemony's deep-range cartography network, a system on the outer rim, a small, insignificant cluster of 6 planets and a fledgling colony known as Kepler 186f had just disappeared. Alara rushed to the main observatory, a sphere of living crystal that offered a real-time map of the galaxy. On the chart, where the Kepler system should have been, there was nothing. Not a debris field, not a cloud of dust, not the fading light of an extinguished star. There was only a smooth, perfect, unbroken expanse of empty space. It had not been destroyed. It had been removed from the canvas of existence. The official hegemony channels were in chaos, but a chaos wrapped in disbelief. The initial reports claimed a massive sensor malfunction, a cascading data failure that had wiped a sector from the charts. Engineers were dispatched. Diagnostic probes were launched. But Ilara knew what had happened. She focused the Lyceum's deep sense arrays on the coordinates, pushing past the visible spectrum, past energy readings, into the substrate of reality itself. And she found it. A faint, residual wrongness. A scar not in space, but in causality. It felt like a phantom limb, a place where something vital had been amputated from the universe. The worst part, however, was what happened next. Within an hour, the hegemony's panic subsided. The reports of a missing system were reclassified as a data hoax, a piece of viral misinformation. The engineers dispatched to the empty coordinates reported finding nothing amiss, because their own records, their own memories, had been subtly altered. To them, the Kepler system had never been there. The correction was spreading. The Ethel were not just erasing space, they were erasing the memory of that space. The second stage, as described in the texts, had begun the fading. The hegemony, in its logical certainty, had already forgotten its first casualty. Alara stood alone in the observatory, the galactic map glowing before her. She was the only one who remembered the 6 planets of Kepler. She was the only one who remembered the colony's name. A terrible weight settled upon her. She was no longer just a curator of dead civilizations. She was now the archivist of a living one, recording its history even as it was being unwritten. She had to find a way to make them remember, to make them see the eraser poised over their own existence. But how do you fight an enemy that consumes the very concept of a fight? How do you warn a people who are being made to forget they were ever in danger? The silence of the Lyceum no longer felt like a place of respectful memory. It felt like a preview of the coming oblivion. The Ethel were here, and their work had just begun. The great, sprawling, noisy, vibrant symphony of the hegemony was being tuned for its final, silent chord. Ilara's first act was one of defiance, a quiet rebellion against the encroaching silence. She knew the Lyceum, with its data streams and memory crystals, was as vulnerable as any other node in the hegemony's network. A record of a thing is not the thing itself, and a memory can be erased as easily as the event it recalls. She needed something more fundamental, a proof that could not be unwritten because it was woven into the very grammar of the universe. She turned away from the grand, glowing map of the galaxy and descended into the Lyceum's foundations, into the stacks of incoherence. This was the sub-basement of history, a place where the archives were not neatly cataloged but were left in their raw, chaotic state thoughts carved into the fossilized bones of leviathans, equations tattooed on the preserved skin of forgotten mathematicians, and quantum states held in suspension within fields of warped spacetime. This was the home of ideas too dangerous or too unstable to be integrated into the hegemony's pristine logic. She sought a defense not against annihilation, but against nullification. And in the heart of the chaos, she found it. The record spoke of a pre-hegemony civilization, the Krell, a race of artisans and physicists who saw no distinction between the two disciplines. They did not build starships. They composed them. They did not create tools. They sculpted them from raw probability. The Krell faced a cataclysm of their own, a cognitive plague that erased concepts from their collective consciousness. In response, their greatest minds developed what the archives called the anchor glyphs. These were not symbols or writings in any conventional sense. They were localized, self-sustaining paradoxes, intricate knots tied in the fabric of causality. An anchor glyph, once inscribed, could not be erased because its very existence was a logical contradiction that held itself in place. It was a scar on reality that refused to heal. To erase it would require the universe to solve an unsolvable equation. The glyphs did not preserve a place or a person, but they could hold a memory, a single, undeniable fact, and protect it from retroactive erasure. It was the ultimate form of historical preservation to make a memory as real and as permanent as a fundamental law of physics. As Elara worked, the ethel's influence deepened across the galaxy, moving from the cosmic to the cultural. It was a slow, creeping dilution of meaning. On the capital world of Cygnus Prime, the grand symphony of 10,000 moons, a piece of music so complex and emotionally resonant that it was said to encapsulate the entire history of the hegemony, began to fail. Musicians would lose their place, their instruments falling silent as they forgot not just the notes, but the very feeling the music was meant to evoke. Within a single cycle, the symphony was deemed unplayable, its core emotional thesis lost. It became a collection of meaningless sounds. Soon after, the poets of the Viridian Nebula found they could no longer write about sorrow. The word itself, and all its synonyms, began to feel alien on their tongues. The concept behind it, a foggy, indistinct ache they could no longer articulate. A collective, low-grade malaise settled over the hegemony. Citizens reported a sense of profound ennui, a feeling that the universe had grown thin and gray, like a copy of a copy of a copy. They were losing their own cultural soul, and their logical minds could only diagnose it as a widespread, inexplicable depression. The Quorum of Edicts issued directives on improving public morale and optimizing joy stimulus in the network, treating the death of meaning as a logistical problem to be solved. Elara felt it too, a constant, nagging whisper in the back of her mind, telling her that her work was pointless, that memory itself was an illusion. She fought it by focusing on the raw, ugly truths in the stacks of incoherence, anchoring herself to the pain and chaos of the past to fight the featureless peace of the ethel. The Krell texts were clear. The anchor glyphs were not a technology one could simply operate. They required a specific kind of mind, a consciousness capable of perceiving and manipulating the quantum foam where causality was still fluid. They required a shaper. The shapers were a class of artisans, once revered, now all but extinct. They created living art, sculptures and structures that were not static but were in a constant state of becoming, their forms shifting based on the memories of those who viewed them. A Shaper's statue of a war hero might appear triumphant to one person and tragic to another, reflecting the complex, contradictory nature of memory itself. The hegemony, in its quest for objective truth and logical purity, had deemed the Shaper's work dangerously subjective. Their art was outlawed as empathetic contagion, a source of emotional and historical instability. Their academies were closed, their tools were destroyed, and their legacy was filed away in the Lyceum under failed artistic philosophies. Ilara's search through the hegemony's census archives, cross-referenced with exile manifests, found one name: Kalen, the last Shaper. He had been exiled decades ago for creating a piece so powerful it had caused riots, a monument that forced a ruling family to confront the brutal truths of their own ascent to power. He had been sent to the Obsidian Maze, a sector of rogue black holes and unstable wormholes where the network's reach was non-existent. It was a place where history went to die. And now, Ilara realized, it was the only place safe from an enemy that used the network as a weapon. Leaving the Lyceum was like tearing off a part of her own soul. It was her home, her purpose, the only place in the galaxy that understood the value of what was lost. She couldn't take a standard hegemony vessel. Its navigation and systems were too integrated with the network, which she now viewed as a compromised artery. In the lowest hangar bay, collecting dust and forgotten stories, was the Whisper, an archaic survey ship from the Age of Expansion. It ran on chaotic mechanics, its engine powered by harnessing the unpredictable energy of pocket dimensions, its navigation computer a strange hybrid of stellar cartography and tarot-like probability cards. It was a relic of a less logical, more intuitive time. It was perfect. The journey to the Obsidian Maze was a disorienting nightmare. The Whisper lurched through space-time, its corridors groaning as it navigated gravitational tides that should have torn it to shreds. The ship's probability drive meant that the journey was not a straight line, but a series of near misses with disaster, each one nudging them closer to their destination. Ilara felt utterly alone, a ghost in a ghost ship, chasing the last practitioner of a dead art form to fight a silent, invisible apocalypse. Kalen's exile was a single, jagged asteroid, hollowed out and sealed with a patchwork of scavenged plating. It tumbled through the chaos, a tiny piece of order in a sea of cosmic madness. When Ilara docked the Whisper and entered the airlock, she found not a noble recluse, but a man worn down to the bone by bitterness and isolation. Kalen was thin, his face a roadmap of scowls, his hands, the hands that could once shape reality, were stained with engine grease and calloused from crude labor. His home was a workshop of failures. Half-formed sculptures littered the space, figures of metal and light that seemed to shiver with uncertainty, their forms collapsing and reforming as if they couldn't decide what they were meant to be. He was trying to create, but without an audience, without a shared pool of memory to draw from. His art had no anchor. He was a shaper trapped in a vacuum of meaning. He met her with a rusty vibroblade in his hand. His eyes narrowed with the suspicion of a man who hadn't seen another soul in 30 years. "The hegemony doesn't have jurisdiction here," he snarled, his voice rough from disuse. "Whatever you want, the answer is no." Ilara didn't flinch. She had not come to represent the hegemony. "I'm not here for them," she said, her voice steady. "I'm here for you, and for your art." She didn't bother with the data slate, with the charts of the missing Kepler system or the network anomalies. Logic had failed with the quorum. It would certainly fail with this man who had been cast out for the crime of being illogical. Instead, she appealed to the only thing he had left. "They are erasing it," she said simply, "not destroying it. Erasing it. The feeling of a song, the idea of sorrow, the memory of a sunset on a world that no longer exists. They are taking the colors from the universe, leaving only the outlines. They are the ultimate critics, and their review is silence." Kalen's cynical glare wavered, a flicker of pained understanding in his eyes. He knew what it was to have meaning stripped away. He lived it every day. But he shook his head. "Let them," he spat. "The hegemony bled the universe of its color long ago. They replaced passion with directives, beauty with efficiency. Maybe this silence is what they deserve." Ilar had anticipated this, the deep, wounding pride of the rejected artist. She held out her hand, not with a slate, but with a small, humming memory crystal from the Lyceum's deepest vault. It was the one that held the psychic scream of the Ethel's ancient victims. "I am not asking you to save the hegemony," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I am asking you to fight for the integrity of the canvas. They are not just erasing the bad art. They are erasing everything. There will be no memory of what was, no triumphs, no failures, only a perfect, sterile, eternal blankness." He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the crystal. "What is that?" he asked. "Proof," Ilara replied. "It is the feeling of being unmade. Touch it. Feel the texture of your enemy." He slowly lowered the vibroblade and reached out. The moment his fingers brushed against the crystal surface, his body went rigid. His eyes, the eyes of a shaper, widened not in fear, but in a kind of horrified, professional awe. He was not just feeling an emotion, he was perceiving a fundamental flaw in the medium of existence itself. It was a chisel stroke that did not carve, but filled in. A brush stroke that did not paint, but removed the pigment. He saw the void where the Kepler system used to be, a patch of reality that was unnaturally, impossibly smooth. It was an aesthetic offense of cosmic proportions. He pulled his hand back as if burned, stumbling away from her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at his own trembling hands, then at the half-formed, flickering sculptures in his workshop. He looked at Ilara, a lone archivist who had traveled through hell to find him. For the first time in decades, the bitterness in his eyes was replaced by a different kind of fire. It was the rage of an artist whose masterpiece was being painted over. He walked over to a heavy, locked chest in the corner of the room, blew a thick layer of dust from its surface, and began to work the ancient lock. "The hegemony took my name and my legacy," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "They left me here to be forgotten." He finally wrenched the chest open. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were his tools, a set of objects that looked like a cross between a sculptor's chisels and a physicist's tuning forks. They hummed with a faint, latent power. But I will not let them be unwritten. The journey back from the obsidian maze was a pilgrimage into a dying world. With Kalen aboard, the whisper felt different, alive with a strange, nervous energy. He did not speak much, his attention consumed by the tools he had unearthed. He polished them, tuned them to frequencies Ilara could not hear, and occasionally he would hold one aloft. his eyes closed as if listening to a conversation she was not privy to. They were flying blind, cut off from the hegemony's network by choice, navigating by the whisper's chaotic drive and the faint, residual light of stars that might no longer exist when they arrived. Elara watched the galactic map, her heart a cold stone in her chest. During their transit, 2 more systems on the outer rim had blinked out of existence, their names and coordinates fading from the charts like ink washed away by a slow, relentless rain. But now, she noticed a new, more insidious pattern. It wasn't just systems vanishing. It was concepts. She picked up fragmented reports on the ship's antiquated comms, stories that made no logical sense. A mining consortium on Tartarus HFY had ceased operations because their geologists had collectively forgotten the principles of tectonic stress. A fleet of transport ships was found drifting aimlessly in the Oort cloud, their crews alive and well, but unable to remember the purpose of trade. The Ethel were accelerating their erasure, moving up the chain from physical matter to abstract thought. They were dismantling the intellectual architecture of the hegemony, brick by forgotten brick. They're not just silencing the past, Kalen said one cycle, looking up from a humming chisel that glowed with a soft, internal light. They're foreclosing on the future. You can't build a starship if you don't believe in the concept of exploration. You can't govern a society if you've forgotten the meaning of justice. He had felt it too, through the subtle vibrations of space-time that his tools allowed him to perceive. It's a conceptual blight, and it's spreading faster than light because it doesn't travel through space. It travels through the medium of consciousness itself. Their destination was not Cygnus Prime, not the heart of the hegemony's power. That, they both knew, would be the most heavily infected place, a world already drowning in the calm, gray tide of meaninglessness. They needed a place with a strong, stubborn identity, a world whose memory was etched not in databanks, but in stone and blood and defiance. They needed a world that remembered how to fight. Elara's search of the Lyceum's archives had pointed to one place, Ragnarok. It was a scar on the hegemony's otherwise pristine history, a planet that had refused to be peacefully integrated, a world of fierce, tribal warriors who had fought the hegemony to a bloody standstill for centuries before finally accepting a grudging, semi-autonomous truce. The people of Ragnarok did not use the network. They communicated through skalds and storytellers. Their history passed down in epic sagas recited around roaring fires. Their memories were analog, organic, and drenched in the kind of passionate, illogical chaos that Elara hoped would be anathema to the Ethel. When the whisper descended through Ragnarok's turbulent, ash-filled atmosphere, it was like entering another age. The surface was a landscape of jagged, iron-rich mountains and smoldering volcanoes, dotted with fortresses built from black, basaltic rock. There were no gleaming spires, no anti-gravity causeways. There was only stone, fire, and a sky the color of a fresh bruise. They were met not by a welcoming committee, but by a phalanx of warriors clad in powered armor that looked both ancient and brutally effective. Their leader was a woman named Jorah, her face a mask of ritual scars, her eyes holding the cold, hard light of a dying star. "The hegemony has no authority here. Off-worlder," she boomed, her voice amplified by her helmet. "State your purpose before we turn your ship into a funeral pyre." Elara stepped forward, holding no weapon, offering no data slate. "We have not come from the hegemony," she said, her voice clear and strong against the howling wind. "We have come to speak to your skalds. We bring a story that must be remembered." Jorah's skepticism was a physical force, but the mention of the skalds, the sacred keepers of her people's memory, gave her pause. They were led to the great hall of the Iron Mountain, a cavernous space carved into the heart of a volcano, lit by rivers of flowing lava that ran in channels along the floor. In the center sat the elder skald, a man so old his skin looked like cracked parchment, his eyes clouded with cataracts, but seeing more than any sighted person. Alara told her story. She spoke of the silence, of the missing stars, of the fading colors. The warriors listened, their faces impassive, but the elder skald's head was cocked, his expression one of intense concentration. Kalen said nothing, but he held one of his tuning fork-like tools, and Alara could see it vibrating gently, resonating with the very air in the hall. When she finished, the hall was silent, save for the crackle of the lava. Jorah scoffed. "You speak of ghosts and disappearing worlds. These are the fantasies of a soft people who have forgotten the feel of a blade in their hand. Our enemies are made of flesh and steel, not silence." But the elder skald raised a trembling hand. "The silence," he rasped, his voice like stones grinding together. "We have felt it." The younger skalds, they find the old songs harder to recall. The saga of the star grief, the lay of the lost embers. The words still come, but the heart behind them is growing faint. He turned his blind eyes toward Alara. "This enemy you describe, it is a thief of sagas." This, finally, was a concept the warriors understood. An enemy that could steal their history, their very identity, was a threat more profound than any invading fleet. The mood in the hall shifted from suspicion to a low, simmering rage. "You said you have a way to fight this," Jorah said, her voice now devoid of mockery. "A way to protect our memories." Kalen stepped forward, his tools laid out on a rough-hewn stone table. "Memory is not just a record," he explained, his voice finding a confidence Alara had not heard before. "It is a structure. It has weight, texture, and resonance. Your sagas are strong because they are reinforced by generations of belief and repetition. They have built a fortress of memory. But even a fortress can be starved into submission." He held up a chisel that pulsed with a faint, golden light. "We will not build walls. We will carve anchors. We will take your most important memory, the story that defines the soul of your people, and we will weave it into the fabric of this world. We will make it so real that to erase it, the Ethel would have to unravel this entire planet, atom by atom." The memory they chose was the story of the first landing, a brutal, desperate tale of survival against impossible odds. A story of defiance that was the bedrock of Ragnarok's identity. The ritual took place at the summit of the highest peak, the Iron Maw, as a violent electrical storm raged around them. The elder skald began the chant, his voice rising in power as he recited the saga, joined by Jorah and her warriors, their voices a roaring chorus against the thunder. Kalen stood at the center, his tools in hand. He was not carving stone. He was sculpting the storm itself. He plunged his chisels into the air, into the heart of the saga being sung around him, grabbing hold of the narrative threads, the raw emotional energy of the memory. The air crackled, the light bent around him. He was a conductor orchestrating a symphony of lightning and memory. Alara stood watch, her senses stretched to their limit, and she felt them. The ethel. They had been drawn by the sudden, intense concentration of meaning, a beacon of defiance in their calm, gray sea. It was not a physical presence, but a pressure, a sudden crushing weight of absolute pointlessness. A wave of profound apathy washed over the mountain. The warriors' voices faltered, the conviction in their chant wavering. The saga felt silly, their history, a childish fantasy, their defiance, a meaningless gesture. Why fight? Why remember? Why exist? The silence was coming for them, not with a roar, but with a soul-crushing whisper of futility. Jorah stumbled, her face slack, the fire in her eyes dimming. The Elder Skald's chant became a weak mumble. The anchor was failing before it could be set. Elara knew she could not fight the Ethel's influence on their terms. She could not outlogic them. But she was an archivist of the fallen. She was a curator of pain, a librarian of tragedy. She reached into her own mind, past the logic and the learning, to the raw, unprocessed grief she had accumulated from 1,000 dead civilizations. She opened the floodgates. She focused on the memory crystal she carried, the psychic scream of the Ethel's first victims, and let that raw, undiluted agony pour out of her. It was a scream of pure, illogical, defiant pain. The wave of apathy shattered. Pain, unlike history or valor, could not be rationalized away. It was a fundamental, irreducible truth. The sudden psychic shriek of agony was a discordant note in the Ethel's silent symphony, a blast of static that momentarily disrupted their influence. The warriors gasped, their eyes clearing as if waking from a trance. The fire returned to Jorah's eyes, hotter and angrier than before. The Elder Skald's voice boomed out once more, finishing the final verse of the saga with a defiant roar. At that exact moment, Kalen plunged his final tool deep into the heart of the memory, twisting it, tying the knot in causality. A bolt of lightning, impossibly bright, struck the peak of the mountain. But it did not dissipate. It held. It solidified into a jagged, crystalline structure, a frozen fractal of lightning that pulsed with a soft, steady light. It was a physical object, yet it cast no shadow. It was a scar, a paradox, an idea made real. It was the anchor glyph, and it hummed with the unbreakable memory of Ragnarok's soul. They had done it. They had saved one story. But as Elara looked out from the mountain peak at the star-dusted sky, she knew their victory was just a single flickering candle in a vast, encroaching darkness. And now they had the Ethel's undivided attention. The Ethel's response was not one of anger or retaliation. It was one of adjustment. They did not attack Ragnarok directly. They simply isolated it, not with a blockade of ships, but with a perimeter of conceptual void. Ships attempting to leave the system found their navigators unable to comprehend the concept of elsewhere. Comm signals sent into the void were not jammed. The operators simply forgot what they were trying to say mid-sentence. Ragnarok had become an island of preserved memory in a sea of encroaching oblivion, a defiant but ultimately isolated fact. For the hegemony at large, the planet and its history simply ceased to be a factor. It faded from the star charts and, more importantly, from the collective consciousness, becoming another forgotten myth. Elara, Kalen, and the people of Ragnarok were now ghosts, alive and real, but haunting a house that no longer remembered them. The victory on the Iron Maw felt hollow. They had saved the book, But the Ethel were now burning the library down around them. The pressure was building, a slow and suffocating quarantine. The anchor glyph on the mountain pulsed with a steady, defiant light, but it was a lonely beacon. "We proved they can be fought," Kalen said, his voice grim as they studied the shimmering non-space that now surrounded the system. "But we also proved that fighting them only makes them adapt. They don't break down the door. They simply remove the concept of the door, and the wall, and the room, until you're standing in an open field, exposed and irrelevant." Alara felt a creeping despair, a chilling echo of the Ethel's own weapon. What good was one preserved memory if the rest of the galaxy forgot how to read? They had won a battle, but the Ethel were winning the war by changing the definition of victory. They needed to do more than just protect memories. They had to restore them. They had to find a way to break the quarantine and reawaken the galaxy to the truth of its own erasure. The answer, Alara suspected, lay not in defiance, but in subversion. The Ethel's strength was their control over the network of consciousness, the shared intellectual and psychic space of the hegemony. Their weakness was that they operated on a plane of pure, cold logic. They erased meaning. But what if there was a force in the universe that was inherently meaningless, yet profoundly impactful chaos? Not the chaos of war or destruction, but the fundamental, unpredictable chaos of creation and art. Kalen, in his exile, had been a shaper without an audience. His art had failed because it had no memories to reflect. But what if they could reverse the process? What if they could use his art not to reflect a memory, but to create a new one? "The anchor glyph on the mountain is a shield," Alara proposed, her mind racing. "It preserves a memory. But what if we could build a beacon, a resonance cascade? The Krell texts called it. An idea so powerful, so illogical, and so emotionally contagious that it couldn't be erased because it would replicate faster than the Ethel could correct it. A piece of art that would infect the hegemony with a memory it didn't know it had." Kalen was skeptical. "Art needs a medium, a canvas. The network is compromised, and there's no way to transmit anything through the void around us." "We won't use the network," Alara countered, a wild, desperate plan forming in her mind. "We'll use the Ethel themselves, their silence, their null space. It's a perfect canvas. It's blank. We won't transmit a signal through it. We'll carve a message into it." The idea was terrifyingly ambitious. They would turn the Ethel's own weapon against them. They would use the void as a medium, using Kalen's shaper tools to inscribe a new, powerful, and utterly illogical idea directly onto the fabric of the null space. It would be the ultimate act of conceptual graffiti. The idea they needed had to be perfect. It couldn't be a call to arms or a logical argument. The Ethel would simply erase it. It had to be a paradox, a piece of emotional data that could not be processed, only felt. They found it not in the sagas of Ragnarok, but in the deepest, most forbidden archive of the Lyceum. A backup data core Alara had brought with her on the Whisper. It was the personal log of the very last citizen of a forgotten race, a being who had watched the Ethel consume its entire civilization. The final entry was not a curse or a plea, but a simple, heartbreakingly profound statement: "I forgive you. Your silence cannot erase the love that created me, and therefore it cannot erase me. Forgiveness." It was the ultimate illogical act, to offer grace to an enemy that did not recognize your existence, to counter absolute nullity with absolute empathy. It was an emotional paradox, a logical impossibility. It was perfect. To power such a massive undertaking, they needed more than the storm on the mountain. They needed a direct line into the raw, chaotic energy of the cosmos. Jorah, now a fervent believer in their cause, led them to the heart of Ragnarok, a geothermal vent that plunged deep into the planet's molten core. It was a place of immense, untamed power, a wound in the world that bled pure energy. Kalen would stand at the edge of this abyss, and with the help of Ragnarok's engineers, they would channel the planet's lifeblood into his tools, turning him into a living conduit. The plan was a long shot, a desperate prayer hurled into the void. As the preparations began, the Ethel's presence grew stronger, more focused. The conceptual blight intensified on Ragnarok. Tools would randomly cease to function as engineers forgot the principles of physics that govern them. The warriors began to find it difficult to distinguish between friend and foe, the concept of ally becoming blurry and indistinct. The Ethel knew what they were planning. They were tightening the noose, attempting to unmake the artists before the art could be created. Ilara became the keeper of the flame, moving through the fortress, countering the creeping apathy with her own fierce will. She did not use logic. She used stories. She recited the sagas. She told the tale of the missing stars. She shared the last words of the forgiven. She fought the silence with a barrage of defiant, emotional noise, keeping the collective mind of Ragnarok focused and alive. The day of the broadcast arrived. Kalen stood on a platform of obsidian suspended over the heart of Ragnarok, the roar of the planet's core a deafening symphony below him. Huge iron cables, glowing red with harnessed energy, were attached to a focusing array that surrounded him. He held his master tool, a chisel that shimmered like a captured star, pointing it not at the sky, but at the emptier silent space that surrounded their world. Jorah and her warriors stood guard, their minds fortified by Ilara's stories, a bulwark of defiant memory. The elder skald began a new chant, not a saga of the past, but a plea for the future. Ilara stood beside the focusing controls, her hand on the prime activator. "Are you ready?" she asked Kalen through her comm. His voice came back, strained but resolute. "An artist is always ready for his final performance. Let's give them a masterpiece." She slammed her hand down. The energy of the planet surged, a torrent of raw power that flowed into Kalen. He screamed, his body arching as he became a vessel for the fire of a world. The chisel in his hand erupted in a blinding flash of light, a beam of pure creative force that shot outwards, striking the invisible wall of the conceptual void. There was no sound, but there was a tremor, a shudder in the very nature of reality. Kalen began to carve. He was not writing words or drawing images. He was sculpting with emotion, using the paradoxical concept of forgiveness as his blade. He carved the feeling of love in the face of annihilation, the warmth of empathy into the cold canvas of the void. He poured the collective soul of every lost civilization Ilara had ever studied into that single, impossible message. Across the galaxy, something broke. On Cygnus Prime, a member of the Quorum of Edicts, lost in its logical trance, suddenly felt a pang of something unfamiliar, a phantom limb of sorrow for a loss it could not name. A musician, staring blankly at a silent instrument, found his fingers tracing the melody of a song he had never heard, a song of profound, heartbreaking grace. A trader, adrift in the Ort cloud, looked out at the stars and was struck by a sudden, overwhelming sense of connection to the strangers on the other side of the void. It wasn't a memory returning. It was a new memory being born, an echo of an event that had never happened but was now fundamentally true. The idea of forgiveness, carved into the void itself, was reflecting back into the hegemony, resonating in the empty spaces of their souls. It was a ghost of a feeling, but it was real. Back on Ragnarok, Kalen collapsed, the energy spent, his tools falling silent. The beam of light faded, but the void around them had changed. It was no longer empty. It shimmered with a faint, opalescent light, like the inside of a seashell, and it hummed with a low, resonant frequency. It was the echo of their message, now a permanent feature of the cosmos. They had not defeated the Ethel, but they had done something far more profound. They had taught the silence how to sing. The song of the void did not bring an immediate victory. It brought chaos. Across the hegemony, the slow, creeping malaise was shattered by a storm of inexplicable emotions. Beings who had not felt a strong passion in centuries were suddenly overwhelmed by waves of vicarious sorrow, unearned joy, and a profound, aching sense of empathy for people they had never met. The Ethel's carefully constructed silence was broken, not by the noise of rebellion, but by the cacophony of a soul remembering itself. The quorum of edicts was paralyzed. Their logic could not process this tidal wave of irrationality. They classified it as a pan-galactic emotional contagion and attempted to issue directives for calming meditations. But it was like trying to put out a forest fire with a teacup. The hegemony was waking up, but it was the violent, disoriented waking of a patient from a long coma. The Ethel, for the first time, were forced to react directly. Their subtler methods of erasure were failing against the persistent, self-replicating memory of forgiveness. Their response was crude, direct, and utterly alien. In the systems closest to the Cygnus X1 singularity, reality itself began to fray. Geometric shapes appeared in the sky, perfect, impossible objects that violated the laws of physics. The passage of time would stutter, looping for minutes or hours before violently snapping back into place. They were no longer erasing the painting. They were tearing holes in the canvas. This was their end game if they could not achieve a perfect, silent order. They would unmake the concept of order itself, collapsing the universe into a state of pure, incoherent chaos. On Ragnarok, the shimmering void around them began to pulse with a malevolent, discordant energy. The song of forgiveness was still there, but it was now competing with the Ethel's new song, a symphony of deconstruction. The anchor glyph on the iron maw flickered, its light dimming as the laws that held its paradoxical structure in place began to warp. "They're breaking the rules," Kalen said, his voice weak but his eyes burning with an artist's fury. He was recovering, but the effort of carving the void had aged him, leaving fine lines of silver in his hair. "They've abandoned their aesthetic. This is not correction. This is a tantrum." Alara knew they were out of time. They had reawakened the galaxy's heart, but the Ethel were now coming for its mind, for the very laws of physics that allowed it to exist. They had one last, desperate card to play. It was not a weapon or a piece of art. It was a truth. "The Lyceum," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The Ethel are not just erasing other civilizations. They are erasing themselves." Kalen and Jura looked at her. confused. In the deepest, most encrypted archives, there are fragments, whispers of a beginning, she explained. The sundered texts call them the architects of silence, but the original translation was different. It was the shepherds of harmony. The texts suggest they were not always like this. They were a race of pure intellect and order who, terrified by the endless, chaotic suffering of the universe, sought to create a perfect, painless peace. They began by editing the most painful memories, the most violent events. But they found that sorrow was intertwined with joy, that loss was the foundation of love. To erase one was to diminish the other, and so they went deeper, erasing the very concepts of passion and individuality until they had erased their own. The Ethel, she explained, were the ultimate cautionary tale. They were a civilization that had committed a slow, methodical suicide of the soul in the pursuit of perfection. The silent, logical void beings were the final result. The program left running after the programmers had deleted themselves. They were a cure that had become a disease, an equation that had forgotten its own purpose. Their current, chaotic rampage was the flailing of a system that had encountered a variable it could not compute forgiveness. It was a concept so alien to their cold logic that it was breaking their core programming. They are not an enemy to be defeated, Elara concluded. They are a memory that needs to be restored. We have to make them remember what they were, what they lost. Their plan was suicidally simple. They would use the Whisper with its chaotic drive to punch a hole through the Ethel's new wall of chaos and make a direct run for the Lyceum. Once there, they would not fight. They would broadcast the Ethel's own lost history, their original memory, directly into the heart of their being. They would hold up a mirror to the ghost. It was a journey from which there would be no return. Ragnarok would be left to its fate, a lonely bastion of memory in a collapsing universe. Jorah and her warriors accepted this with a grim stoicism. A saga is not defined by its length, but by the truth it tells. The Elder Skald told them before they departed, "Go, make our ending a worthy one." The flight through the Ethel's deconstruction field was a journey through a fever dream. The Whisper twisted through corridors of non-reality, past stars that melted like wax and planets that folded in on themselves. Kalen, his hands on his tools, acted as the ship's navigator, using his shaper's senses to find the seams in the chaos, the brief moments of stability in the storm. Elara sat wired into the Lyceum's data core, focusing her entire being on the single, fragile memory of the Shepherds of Harmony, protecting it from the insanity outside. They arrived to find the Lyceum untouched, a perfect sphere of calm in the heart of the storm. The Ethel had left it alone, for in their logic, a library of the dead was already silent, already in harmony with their purpose. It was a fatal oversight. Elara and Kalen made their way to the central chamber, the heart of all the galaxy's lost stories. "This is it," Elara said, placing her hands on the master console. "Once I begin the broadcast, their full attention will be here. They will unmake this place, and us with it." Kalen looked at her, and for the first time, he smiled, a genuine, sad, beautiful smile. "There are worse ways to end a story," he said. "To be a final, defiant brushstroke on a canvas about to be consumed. It's a fitting legacy for the last shaper." Lara took a deep breath and initiated the broadcast. She didn't send it out into the network. She channeled it inward. turning the entire Lyceum into a psychic resonator, focusing the Ethel's lost memory into a single, piercing note of pure remembrance. The response was instantaneous. The fabric of space around the Lyceum tore open, and for the first time, Alara and Kaelin saw them. They were not beings of matter, but constructs of pure, perfect geometry, vast, silent shapes that blotted out the stars. They converged on the Lyceum, their silent, orderly rage a palpable force. But the memory was already reaching them. A flicker of something ancient and long forgotten stirred within their perfect forms. A tremor of dissonance. A ghost of a feeling. The geometric shapes began to waver, their perfect lines blurring. They were remembering the chaos of their own birth. They were remembering love and the pain that came with it. They were remembering the impossible choice they had made. The Lyceum began to crumble around Alara and Kaelin, the data streams shattering into light, the memory crystals exploding like novas. Alara closed her eyes, holding on to the memory, broadcasting it with the last of her strength. She felt Kaelin's hand find hers in the collapsing darkness. The Ethel's attack faltered. A great, collective wave of sorrow, a grief held back for 1 billion years, washed through them. They remembered their failure. They remembered that in their quest to end suffering, they had become the ultimate cause of it. And they stopped. The chaos across the galaxy ceased. The deconstruction fields evaporated. The silence remained. But it was no longer a void. It was a silence of contemplation, of mourning. In the heart of what was once the Lyceum, 2 new stars began to glow. Twin suns born from the final, defiant act of an archivist and a shaper. Across the reawakened hegemony, a new legend was born, not a saga of war, but a story of 2 souls who had answered an eternity of silence with a single, whispered word of truth. The Ethel did not vanish. They retreated into the deep voids between galaxies, no longer a threat, but a silent, eternal reminder of the price of perfection. The galaxy was scarred, its history full of new, strange gaps and phantom memories, but it was alive. It was messy, chaotic, beautiful, and free. Peace had not been won. It had been remembered. And in the quiet corners of the cosmos, when a poet looked for the right word to describe a bittersweet sorrow, or a musician reached for a chord that held both love and loss, they would sometimes feel a faint, warm echo from a pair of distant, nameless stars, the last, enduring anchor of a story that had refused to be forgotten,